There is a photograph that almost nobody has seen. It shows a column of U.S. Army trucks stretching so far back you can't see where it ends, stuck in the mud somewhere in the middle of Wyoming in the summer of 1919. The vehicles aren't moving. They can't. The road has essentially dissolved under them. And somewhere in that convoy, sweating through his uniform and watching another truck get winched out of a ditch, is a 28-year-old Army lieutenant colonel named Dwight David Eisenhower. He's not there on urgent orders. He joined this trip, by his own account, partly for a lark. And he had absolutely no idea that what he was experiencing in that Wyoming mud was going to shape the physical landscape of the United States of America and eventually the rest of the world. That trip took 62 days. 62 days to cross the country. The convoy covered just over 3,000 miles at an average speed of roughly 6 miles an hour. And those roads they traveled on? Eisenhower himself later said they varied from, and I'm using his exact words here, average to non-existent. From Illinois through Nevada, there was practically no pavement at all. Think about that. This was 1919, not 1819. The automobile had already been around for decades, and the United States of America, the most powerful economy on Earth at the time, couldn't get an Army convoy from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco without the trucks breaking down a couple hundred times, bridges collapsing under the weight, and the whole operation running a week behind schedule. That moment planted a seed, and 37 years later, President Eisenhower would sign a piece of legislation that is, by almost any measure, the largest public works project in American history. A project so transformative that, according to Federal Highway Administration research, roughly a quarter of the entire nation's productivity growth between 1950 and 1989 can be attributed to it. A project so visionary that country after country, from Europe to Asia, looked at what America had built and said, "We need to do that too."
Today, we're going to talk about the Interstate Highway System. Not the version you learned about in a 5-minute textbook sidebar, but the real story, the political fights, the impossible engineering, the communities it lifted and the communities it crushed, and why this network of roads remains one of the most consequential things this country has ever built. Let me break this down for you, because this story deserves to be told. To understand why the interstate system was so revolutionary, you have to understand what America's roads actually looked like before it. We're talking about a country where the federal government had almost no involvement in road building. Roads were the business of states and counties. The result was a patchwork mess. There were numbered U.S. highways, Route 66, Route 1, the famous ones, but these were not high-speed roads. They ran through the middle of towns. They had traffic lights and railroad crossings and farm equipment pulling out from dirt paths. They were, in many stretches, barely improved from what they had been in the horse and buggy era. Bridges broke under the weight of modern trucks. There was no standardization of anything. Lane width, grade, signage, nothing. And this was the transportation backbone of the world's largest economy. The military understood the problem better than anyone, because they had tried to use these roads in wartime and failed. The 1919 convoy that young Eisenhower rode with was actually a formal Army experiment designed to answer the question, can we move troops and equipment across the country if we have to? The answer, delivered in the most humiliating possible fashion over 62 days of breakdowns and bridge collapses, was barely and horribly. The convoy passed through some 350 communities along the way, and by all accounts, the American public loved it. Crowds turned out everywhere to cheer them on and give them food. But behind the celebration, the Army officers who filed their reports were blunt. The roads were inadequate, the bridges were dangerous. Federal involvement was not optional, it was essential. A national emergency would be a catastrophe on these roads. Then came World War II, and Eisenhower got his second great lesson. As the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, he watched the German military use their Autobahn network, the system of high-speed, controlled-access, divided highways that Germany had been building since the 1930s, to move soldiers and equipment with a speed and efficiency that was impossible on normal roads. And then, as the Allied armies swept into Germany, Eisenhower used those same Autobahns to pursue the retreating enemy. He saw firsthand what a properly built highway system could do for a nation's military strength, its economic productivity, and its ability to function as a unified whole. He later put it simply. The old convoy, he said, had started him thinking about good two-lane highways, but Germany had made him see the wisdom of broader ribbons across the land. When Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States in 1953, highways were near the top of his agenda. And here's something most people don't know. He didn't just want to build roads, he had what he called a grand plan. The plan had two goals, and understanding both of them explains everything about why the system was built the way it was. The first goal was national defense. This was the height of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. American cities were potential targets. Eisenhower's generals told him that if nuclear war came, they would need to be able to evacuate urban populations quickly, move military assets across the country, and keep supply lines functioning under attack. The official name of the project tells you exactly what this was: the National System of Interstate and Defense Highways. Defense wasn't an afterthought, it was half the entire point. The second goal was economic. America in the mid-1950s was a nation in the middle of a massive industrial and population boom. Factories were producing goods at unprecedented rates. Trucks were becoming the dominant way to move freight. But those trucks were still crawling through the same inadequate roads, the same small-town main streets, the same narrow bridges.
Eisenhower understood, with the clarity of a military commander, that you cannot run a modern economy on a transportation network designed for a previous century. He wanted to knit the country together. He wanted to make it possible to drive, or ship goods, from Miami to Seattle without ever hitting a stoplight, without ever worrying about a weight limit on a bridge, without ever getting stuck behind a tractor on a two-lane road. The political fight to make it happen was brutal, and this is the part of the story that never gets told. Eisenhower's first proposal went to Congress and died. The fundamental disagreement was about money, specifically how to pay for it. Some wanted bonds, which would rack up debt. Others refused to allow deficit spending. For 2 years, one of the most important pieces of legislation in American history stalled because of an argument about financing. What eventually broke the deadlock was an idea from the House side of Congress, a dedicated fund fed by user taxes, primarily a tax on gasoline, that would exist solely to build and maintain highways. The users of the roads would pay for the roads. It was elegant, it was bipartisan, and it worked. The bill that finally passed had the fingerprints of both sides of the aisle on it. The Senate approved it by an overwhelming vote. The House followed. And on June 29, 1956, Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act into law. Not at a ceremony, not at a desk in the Oval Office, but from a hospital bed at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, where he was recovering from emergency surgery. He signed a stack of bills that day. This one would change America forever. The scale of what Congress had just authorized was staggering. The legislation called for more than 40,000 miles of highway, an entirely new road network built to unified national standards connecting every major American city. The federal government would pay 90% of the costs. States would cover the remaining 10%. The money would come from the Highway Trust Fund, and the whole thing was expected to be substantially complete within 15 years or so. It would not, in fact, be complete until 1992, 36 years later. Because no one had ever built anything like this before, and they were figuring it out as they went. The engineering challenges were almost incomprehensible. Think about what it means to build 40-some thousand miles of highway to a single unified standard across a country that contains the Rocky Mountains, the Mojave Desert, the Appalachian Range, the Florida swamps, the Great Plains, and the urban cores of the most densely populated cities on Earth. Every interchange had to be designed to allow a vehicle traveling at highway speed to enter and exit without stopping. Every overpass had to be tall enough to clear military vehicles, including some of the largest equipment in the Army's arsenal. Every bridge had to be built to handle the heaviest loads that trucks could legally carry. The grade, the steepness, on any portion of the highway could not exceed a certain percentage, which meant that in mountainous terrain, engineers were blasting through mountains and filling valleys to create a road surface that met the standard. The first project under the new law was awarded in Missouri in August of 1956, just weeks after Eisenhower signed the bill. Within months, construction was underway in states from coast to coast. And here's the part that gets me every time I think about it, is this network of roads spread across the country, it began to do things nobody had fully planned for. The economic effects were profound and immediate. Towns and cities that had been bypassed by geography suddenly found themselves on a major artery. The Sun Belt, places like Atlanta, Dallas, Phoenix, Charlotte, grew at rates that would have been impossible without the interstates connecting them to the rest of the country and to each other. Trucking became the dominant freight industry in America almost overnight. The cost of shipping goods fell sharply.
The supply chain that we now take for granted, where a truck can carry products from a factory in one state to a distribution center in another, and then to a store shelf in a third, all within a few days, that supply chain was built on the back of the interstate system. Economists at the National Bureau of Economic Research have concluded that if you removed the interstate system from the American economy today, real GDP would decline by hundreds of billions of dollars, not over time, immediately, because the entire logistics infrastructure of the country runs through it. Tourism was transformed as well. Before the interstates, taking a family road trip across the country was a serious undertaking that required careful planning and acceptance of the fact that you might encounter roads that were genuinely impassable. After the interstates, it became the quintessential American experience. The interstate motel, the interstate rest stop, the interstate gas station. An entire industry built along the shoulders of these roads. Howard Johnson's, Holiday Inn, McDonald's drive-thrus. These businesses didn't just appear alongside the interstates by accident. They were specifically built to serve the tens of millions of Americans who were now driving hundreds of miles for the first time in their lives. The Interstate Highway didn't just change how Americans moved. It changed how Americans lived, what they ate, where they slept, and where they built their homes. But here is where honesty requires us to slow down, because this story has a shadow side, and it would be wrong to tell it any other way. The interstate system was built through communities, and in too many cases, particularly in cities, particularly in minority neighborhoods, the route chosen for a highway was not the most efficient route, it was the cheapest route, which meant the route through the neighborhoods where land was least expensive, which in mid-century America meant black neighborhoods, immigrant neighborhoods, working-class neighborhoods that didn't have the political power to fight back. According to research that the Federal Highway Administration itself has documented, the construction of the interstate system displaced approximately 1 million people in the 2 decades following the 1956 Act. Not eminent domain buyouts that left people comfortable. Displacement. Communities in Nashville, Miami, Chicago, Detroit, and dozens of other cities were cut in half by highways, or simply bulldozed. Neighborhoods that had been thriving were severed from the economic life of their cities by concrete walls that nobody asked for and nobody wanted. This is the complexity that great achievements carry. The same network of roads that lifted the American economy and connected this sprawling country also ran a highway through the heart of Overtown in Miami, through the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul, through thriving communities in cities across the South and the North.
The people who designed this system were not, for the most part, monsters. They were engineers and planners working within the assumptions of their time, in an era when urban renewal was treated as an unambiguous good, and when the political and legal tools to stop a highway project didn't really exist yet. But knowing that doesn't change what happened to those communities. And part of telling this story honestly means saying, yes, we built something remarkable, and we also failed some of the people who were supposed to benefit from it. Both of those things are true. What happened next in the global story is what the title of this video is really about. Because America didn't just build a highway system. America proved a concept. For the first time in history, a country had shown that you could build a unified, nationally standardized, fully controlled access superhighway network at continental scale, and that doing so would transform your economy in ways that were almost impossible to overstate. The world watched, and the world took notes. The numbering system that South Korea uses for its expressways today is explicitly modeled on the logic of the American interstate numbering system. The European Union's motorway networks, Germany's autobahns in their modern form, France's autoroutes, Italy's autostrada, all share design DNA with what America built in the 1950s and 60s. But perhaps the most dramatic example is China. China began building its own expressway network in the 1980s, explicitly using the American interstate model as a reference point for what a national highway system could achieve. By 2011, China's expressway network had surpassed the total length of the American interstate system. Today, it is the longest expressway network in the world. And it was built, at least in part, because Chinese engineers and planners looked at what the United States had accomplished and understood its economic logic. India is doing the same thing right now. Brazil has been working toward it for decades. Nation after nation, when they decide it's time to connect their country in a serious way, when they want to do for their economy what the interstate did for America, they reach for the same playbook, a standardized, controlled access highway network, dedicated funding, federal standards enforced at the national level, the American model. Not because America told them to, because the evidence of what it does to an economy is overwhelming. The system today stretches nearly 49,000 miles. Nearly a quarter of all vehicle miles driven in the United States happen on the interstate system, even though it represents just over 1% of the country's total road mileage. Think about that ratio for a moment. 1% of the roads carrying 25% of the traffic. It is, by any engineering or economic measure, the most efficient large-scale road network ever built. It is also one of the most used pieces of public infrastructure on Earth every single day by truckers and commuters and families and emergency vehicles and military convoys. Every package you've ordered online that arrived at your door passed through this system. Every piece of produce in your refrigerator almost certainly traveled on it. Every car part, every piece of lumber, every roll of fabric, every pharmaceutical product. It moves on these roads. I was digging through this history and found something that genuinely blew my mind, and it was this. The conversation that led to the Federal Aid Highway Act started in 1954, and the act was signed in 1956. 2 years from concept to legislation for the largest public works project in American history. When you compare that to how long it now takes to get highway projects approved, funded, and built, when you read about projects that have been in environmental review for 15 years and still haven't broken ground, you realize that there was something about that particular moment in American history, that particular combination of political will and institutional capability and genuine national purpose that we have not fully replicated since. Eisenhower wanted to build a superhighway system. Congress, for once, figured out how to pay for it, and then American workers built it, mile by mile, through mountains and deserts and cities and swamps for 36 years until it was done. Here's what I want you to take from this story. The Interstate Highway System is not just a historical achievement, it is a living argument about what government, properly directed, can accomplish when it decides to think at the scale that a nation actually requires. It is a story of a young Army officer stuck in Wyoming mud who spent the rest of his life thinking about what good roads could mean for his country. It is a story of engineers solving problems that had never been solved before, in terrain that had never been crossed at highway speed. It is a story of the kind of visionary investment that pays dividends for generations. The researchers find that the economic value it generates still exceeds the cost of building it, not in some narrow accounting sense, but at the level of GDP, in trade and employment and quality of life. And yes, it is also a story that includes real harm done to real communities, harm that we are still reckoning with today. That complexity doesn't diminish the achievement, it makes it more human. It makes it the real story, rather than the mythologized one. The next time you get on an interstate, it doesn't matter if it's I-95 on the East Coast, I-10 in the South, I-80 cutting across the heartland, or I-5 on the West Coast. You're driving on something that a 28-year-old lieutenant colonel dreamed about from the back of an Army convoy that was going 6 miles an hour through Wyoming mud. You're driving on something that every other country in the world eventually looked at and decided to copy. You're driving on the largest public works project in American history, and it is still doing exactly what it was built to do. I want to ask you something in the comments. Which interstate highway has the most meaning to you, and why? Maybe it's the one you drove to get to college. Maybe it's the one your parents drove to bring the family somewhere every summer. Maybe it's the one you drive to work every morning. These roads are part of the fabric of American life in a way that's almost invisible, precisely because they're so constant. Tell me your story. If this is the kind of American history that should be in every classroom, share it. There are millions of people who don't know this story, and they should. Subscribe if you want more of this, real American history, the kind that's too good and too complicated to fit in a textbook. I'll see you in the next one.